Buried beneath the ashes of ancient Alaska, two lost children carried a secret older than history, and their DNA may change where America began. Origins of the first Americans. She is called Shut-it-Yet in the Tanacross Athabascan dialect. Sunrise Girl Child was only a few months old when she died. Her partly cremated remains were found in 2013 in a hidden burial pit with the remains of a stillborn fetus. Their bodies were covered in red ochre and placed on a bed of antler tips at the bottom of a freshly dug pit, with her lying on her back and her knees pulled tight against her chest. The ochre on her bones suggests that she and the fetus were wrapped in shrouds. It is possible they were twins with bone and tooth evidence also, showing that the fetus may have been buried first. The fetus has been given the name Yet Dawn Twilight Child Girl. Their short lives ended about 11,500 years ago. They were found at the Upward Sun River site in the Tanana River Valley of central Alaska, a late Pleistocene burial site. The low, wind-covered sand dunes of this valley have been excavated by archaeologist Ben A. Potter since 2006, revealing a wide area filled with scattered artifacts. Carbon dating and layer-by-layer ground study showed that this river basin was likely a seasonal hunting site for Paleo-Indians from about 13,000 to 8,000 years ago. During that time it grew to include permanent structures. One of these had a clay hearth. The bones of many bird, mammal and fish species have been found on top of this hearth, and nowhere else nearby, meaning that for the nomadic hunter-gatherers who built it, this was their cooking surface, fire pit and bone disposal pit all in one. The two food species that appear most in the bone pile are salmon and squirrel. But food was not the only thing found there. The bones of a cremated 3-year-old child were first identified on this hearth in 2010, 3 years before Sunrise Girl Child and Dawn Twilight Child Girl were found. That child is known as Upward Sun River Mouth Child. The timeline that the archaeologists have put together is that the hearth had been built and used long before the girl children died. The first to be buried was the partly cremated fetus. A burial pit was dug into the base of the hearth and the body was placed inside. Clues from the site, such as the position of the bodies, lead researchers to think Sunrise Girl Child was partly cremated and buried weeks or months later. Then every sign shows that the pit was quickly filled back in with sediment and the bones of their meals. The hearth was used for another season or two, perhaps a few years, before the 3-year-old Upward Sun River Mouth Child was cremated on top of the hearth. It was then purposely buried, and the people who lived there moved away. To anthropologists, these behaviors are surprising. They have not been seen in similar situations. There are only a few similar North American Ice Age burial sites that have been discovered. The south-central Alaska Nenana complex sites have been dated to 11,800 years ago, and the more central Denali complex sites from 10,000 to 7,000 years ago. In none of the others has a cremated child been found. Potter argues in his paper, New Insights into Eastern Beringian Mortuary Behavior, a terminal Pleistocene double infant burial at Upward Sun River, that these are unique funeral practices that show no real connection to the other burial sites that have been studied. These insights into their social traditions suggest that they may be a newly discovered, separate Alaskan culture. Even though Sunrise Girl Child and Dawn Twilight Child Girl were buried first, it was not until 2013 that the hidden burial pit was found in a layer beneath the hearth, and the remains of the ochre-covered infants were revealed. Beside their bodies lay stone tools and other organic and stone grave goods, including the earliest known North American hafted biface stone spear, points with decorated antler foreshafts. These spears must have been valuable to a hunter-gatherer society, and their being placed in the grave shows how much losing these children meant. But what makes the discovery of Sunrise Girl Child and Dawn Twilight Child Girl even more important to our understanding of the origins of the first Americans is that they still had something that the burned bones of Upward Sun River Mouth Child did not: recoverable DNA. That DNA identifies these children as members of a Paleo-Indian population that no longer exists. Researchers argue that they were descendants of the first wave of settlers who crossed the Bering Land Bridge perhaps 20,000 years ago. These groups eventually followed pathways from north to south that had cleared of ice and crossed all of North America, Central America, and eventually South America. But it all began around 47,000 years ago in Siberia and Central Asia. The late Pleistocene was the age of ice ages and land bridges, and it was the age of great migrations by modern humans. As more land became open to these ancient nomads, they moved for the first time from Asia into North America, mostly in small moving groups of 20 to 60 related people. All of these cultures made stone blades in different styles that changed by region and time. Some were used for scraping hides or perhaps for body use such as shaving. Some were fixed to antler or bone foreshafts and used to hunt the many kinds of game in the forests and rivers, although many of their winters may have been times of deep hardship. A short list of the animals paleobiologists have identified in this region includes the American mastodon, ancient kinds of camels and deer family animals such as elk, moose and deer and panthera, animals like cougar and cheetah, and the giant American lion which could reach 400 kilograms. They also hunted early kinds of musk ox and bison, horse and giant beaver. The nomads followed these and other species across what is now known as the Mammoth Steppe, as shown by the number of butchered mammoth bones that have been found in northern Siberia from this time. We know Native Americans came from Siberian and East Asian peoples, but many of the details are still unknown, and the subject remains one of the most debated in all of anthropology. How and when did the Paleo-Indians first arrive? Do all modern Native Americans share common ancestry, or did different ethnic groups come in waves? How and when did these migrating populations spread southward across both North and South America? The DNA from Sunrise Girl Child and Dawn Twilight Child Girl gives more support to what is becoming a more standard theory about the origins of the first Americans. Modern humans came out of Africa more than 60,000 years ago, when haplogroups that still remain in populations today first appeared. The paternal lineages Q, R1 and CP39 arose in Siberia and Central Asia and moved east toward the far edges of the continent. Nearly all of the peoples of pre-contact North and South America come from these same few haplogroups. Genetic studies have shown that up to 95% of native North, Central and South Americans share a lineage that first separated from other East Asian populations while still in southern Siberia or near Lake Baikal about 36,000 years ago, give or take 1,500 years. The mitochondrial or maternal DNA of this same 95% of modern Amerindians contains haplogroups A, B, C, D or X. It also shows that they all share a single ancestor who appeared in Central Asia, although X is the only one with no modern presence there. This strange absence has led to different models, including the Solutrean hypothesis, that try to explain how haplogroup X moved across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. This model connects the first peopling of the Americas with European populations instead. But so far, aside from a number of strange, unusual bones without DNA that have been found in northern Norway and a similarity between prehistoric European stone tools and those found in Clovis, New Mexico, the mitochondrial DNA evidence that we do have has not convinced the academic community of any prehistoric migration across the Atlantic, at least not from more than 20,000 years ago, as its supporters claim. But other researchers have made connections between the first Americans and populations that ended up in Western Asia and Europe. Meet the Malta boy. Beginning in the 1920s, the Malta site near the shores of Lake Baikal has been carefully studied. A young boy's skeleton was kept in museum collections for decades before Willersleff and his team were able to sample mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA taken from inside an upper arm bone. He was between 3 and 4 years old at the time of his death, a little more than 22,000 years ago. He had brown hair, dark eyes and freckles. An ivory crown decorated his skull and a pendant with a carved bird symbol hung from his neck. But his lineages seemed all wrong. At first, they did not believe the results and assumed that the UNR haplogroups they found had come from too much handling by European researchers. But then the team began to see UNR haplogroups in other related remains, and they began to build a hypothesis. The real surprise is that Malta boy has no relation to current East Asian populations. He is more related to the peoples who eventually migrated westward and laid the foundations for the first European lineages. But this does not mean, as many news outlets claimed at the time, that Native Americans are European. These founding populations still begin in Central Asia in a time before such differences mattered. The great open spaces of Alaska were connected to Siberia from around 30,000 to 11,000 years ago. Conditions seem to have been the most likely for immigration out of Siberia from west to east about 20,000 years ago, when the land was not too barren and the glaciers of the region pulled back. So this has become a time that many anthropologists and archaeologists have focused on as the moment when the very first humans walked into the Americas. Researchers have identified long periods when the glaciers blocked movement and trapped whole populations of humans and animals, sometimes for thousands of years. These kinds of isolating events and the mutations they cause and strengthen over generations are what first divided modern humans into separate haplogroups in Africa. In 2018, the DNA found in Sunrise Girl Child and Dawn Twilight Child Girl was studied in depth by an international team led by Danish evolutionary geneticist Eske Willerslev. In a paper published by Nature, Terminal Pleistocene Alaskan Genome reveals first founding population of Native Americans. They found that by comparing the infant genomes to all other Native American samples, both modern and ancient, the children were found to be from an earlier branch of the lineage that all Native Americans share. Other ancient Arctic and subarctic burial samples, like the Nanana and Denali, were found to be only distantly related. They were a newly discovered people, a long-lost population that researchers call the Beringians, trapped by glaciers on every side. These Pleistocene nomads likely lived in a 1,000-kilometer-wide stretch of northeastern Siberia, the Kamchatka Peninsula and Alaska called Beringia, for at least 5,000 years. Mitochondrial DNA from multiple ancient samples and blood group distributions support the theory that the population who lived in Beringia during that time was trapped on a land bridge that today is mostly under the freezing waters of the Bering Sea. The last glacial maximum had exposed the land, but it also created impossible walls of ice to the east in Alaska and back the way they had come in Siberia. A number of mutations have been found in mitogenome samples that can usually only be made stronger by a population that had no outside genetic influences for 5,000 years. This effect has been found in many other studies on Beringian dig sites and in paleolinguistic research as well. The theory is now called the Beringian standstill population. Sunrise Girl Child and Dawn Twilight Child Girl are the local descendants, perhaps as much as 8,000 years later, of that standstill population. That does not mean they are the descendants most closely related to the Beringians, however. Later migrations swept across Alaska and Canada and mostly replaced the original population. The difficulty researchers face when trying to build models of the migrations of the first Americans is that there are so many complicating factors across such a long period of time, and new discoveries have recently come so quickly and forcefully in academic terms, that no one can yet claim they have built a fully complete theory. A lot of that is due to the changing climate over thousands of years, the presence or absence of ice, and the great megafauna migrations that responded to each change. These first Paleo-Indians followed the herds into the New World on foot, and so far our earliest evidence of them is in Clovis, New Mexico, about 11,600 years ago. Or perhaps they migrated south along the coast by boat. The Monte Verde discoveries in Chile may be somewhere between 14,600 and 18,500 years old. They are the example most often used by those who believe that the peopling of the Americas was first done not on land, but along the western coast, following the currents of the Pacific. But their hypothesis has yet to gain agreement in archaeological circles, mainly because the dating methods used at Monte Verde remain strongly debated, and most of the sites any migrating boat people would have used followed a coast that is now under an average of 100 meters of water. Yet archaeogenetics and paleogenomics have been able to add many insights into the history of the first Americans. Autosomal DNA samples of Native Americans show that pre-European contact genetic diversity gets lower the farther one lives from the Bering Strait. Samples of Native, modern, and ancient South American mitochondrial DNA suggest that those who followed the coast might indeed have reached southern Chile by 18,500 years ago. Here is what linguists have to say about these peoples. In a 2014 PLOS-1 paper, Linguistic Phylogeny Support Back Migration from Beringia to Asia, researchers compare how ancient languages borrowed terms and developed new ones to provide insights into ancient migrations. Although they admit most migrations came before the generally accepted 8 to 10,000 year limit of the traditional comparative method of historical linguistics, they continue, DNA evidence supports at least 3 migrations, with the earliest 15 to 40,000 years before present referred to generally as the Paleo-Indian and connected with the greatest spread of language and cultural groups across North, Meso- and South America. The second, 12 to 14,000 years before present, is the Nadine, spread in North America from Alaska to the Pacific Northwest and from Canada to the U.S. Southwest. And the third, about 9,000 years before present, is Eskimo Aleut with circumpolar distribution. Linguists have classified Eskimo Aleut and Nadine as separate language stocks, and the rest of the languages of the Americas as belonging to many different stocks, but have otherwise been mostly silent on questions that connect Asian and American populations because, with the exception of Eskimo Aleut, the dates of these earlier connections lie beyond the traditionally accepted limit for comparative reconstruction. For the record, the term Eskimo is problematic on a number of levels. To quote from the Wikipedia page on the subject, many Inuit, Yupik, Aleut, and other individuals consider the term Eskimo, which has a disputed origin, to be unacceptable and even insulting. Eskimo continues to be used within a historical, linguistic, archaeological, and cultural context. It is within that formal linguistic context that it is used here. The Yenisei River is a region in Siberia whose language families spread to northern China and Central Asia in Paleolithic times. One idea for their success, when all other language and ethnic groups were erased over 10,000 years ago by invasions of Altaic pastoralists who bred reindeer for food, is that they were able to survive along the swampy edge of the Yenisei River, because mosquitoes kept the reindeer from doing well. For the Nadine, an ethnic and language family that includes everyone from the Ayak and Tlingit of Alaska to the Athabascan speakers of Canada and California to the Navajo in the American Southwest, their descendants may owe their migration success and survival into modern times to the humble mosquito. Linguists have studied a connection from 15,000 years ago between haplogroup Q and Yeniseian languages that appears to be the bridge between Central Asia and the New World. Their conclusion: we use Bayesian model comparisons based on Bayes factors to test the fit between the linguistic phylogenies modeling the two dispersal hypotheses. Our results support an argument that, if the Dean-Yeniseian connection is true, it more likely reflects radiation out of Beringia, with both eastward migrations into North America and westward migration into Asia, rather than a one-way migration from Asia to North America. This supports the growing number of studies that conclude that once the Beringian standstill population was released from its glacial prison, it spread back into Siberia as well as moved forward into the unpeopled Americas. The glaciers finally retreated, and the Laurentide ice sheet became passable around 15 to 20,000 years ago during the Quaternary glaciation, when sea levels were quite low. The population that had been trapped for so long now migrated south and east through Canada. Their genetics tell us that they met no one new along the way. They only carried haplogroups that arose in Central and East Asia on the far side of the Bering Strait, and they spent the next 1 to 2,000 years migrating south overland all the way to Tierra del Fuego. Again, they may have traveled along a coast that has long been underwater, or they followed the ice-free corridor on the east side of the Rockies, which remained covered by the Cordilleran ice sheet long after the plains of the North American interior had become ice-free. The maternal haplogroup X2A has been traced through this interior corridor, and mitochondrial DNA of D4H3A shows that people likely followed the Pacific coast to the south between 15 and 17,000 years ago. There is also the Kelp Highway hypothesis, advanced by coastal anthropologists, which has studied the possibility that the rich kelp forests of the Pacific coast from Japan to Beringia down to California could have easily supported a migrating population during this time. If coastal populations with the same genetic background did come down the coast first, the walking migrants might have met their distant cousins in the river deltas and watersheds of the North American and South American West Coast. But so far, mitochondrial and autosomal DNA neither supports nor rejects that idea. Now for the 5% of the Native American population that this research does not explain. The Inuit-speaking populations of southern Alaska and British Columbia represent a haplogroup that arrived as a later second East Asian wave. Other later waves arrived from Greenland and East Asia. A debated finding that North American and Andean samples share a mutation with Japanese Jaman remains unresolved, but the disputed arrival of populations from Polynesia into the Amazon and from Africa to the Caribbean seems to have no serious followers for those theories. But the arguments are far from over. In the process of writing this article, a new discovery from southern China reveals even more clues. Meetmingzi Ren, first discovered in Red Deer limestone cave in Yunnan, China in 1989, this skull and bones were first Identified as a mosaic human male, neither fully modern nor Neanderthal, about 9,000 years old. After years of trying to extract DNA from the remains, researchers finally succeeded in 2022. The mitochondrial DNA they found revealed several surprising things. First, Mengzi Rin was female, so she may perhaps need a new name. Second, she lived about 14,000 years ago. And third, she belonged to a maternal haplogroup descended from the M9 lineage that connects her to the lineages who originally peopled the Americas. Two models fit the data that they discovered. One that, like the DNA of Sunrise Girl child, this is an example of a leftover population left behind by migrants who found success elsewhere. Or it might be that this is an example of a coastal population who had already been to the Americas and returned all the way back to southern China. True, this might point to a surprisingly high level of travel along the North Pacific coasts over thousands of years. So much of this story remains untold. Many native oral traditions in both North and South America speak of their first arrival on their lands only to find that someone was already there. Who were these old ones? Were their people pushed aside? How many waves swept the old peoples aside for the Americas to be settled yet again? We may never fully know. The final thought on this subject is in their names. These children who were the last relations we know of the Beringians never knew much of life. But their distantly related descendants at the Healy Lake Council still feel the need to honor them and recognize their existence and importance. So let us do the same and say farewell. To shut it yet.